It depends on your willingness. Effectively say, I've run on this, I firmly believe that this is the right position, and if you firmly believe to such a degree that mind is closed, I cannot accept any other alternative, even if you come to me with evidence that I'm wrong, that's I think where you cross the line. So you can have a strong position, you can say I'm going to be advocate on this, but my mind is still open to be changed if I can be convinced that I'm wrong. And only you can make that decision, or the particular councillor involved can actually make the decision. I had to go back to a new elected member training session a few years ago, and we had a group of councillors elected in a council not far from Wellington, who had been elected on a platform to stop the development of a particular airport. And we had the solicitor from the Office of Auditor General running that session, and naturally she was asked. And they were very keen, and her advice was that they had pretty much barred themselves from the decision. So they had campaigned and stood on this issue, and were somewhat disappointed to find that in the Office of the Auditor General's view that they were actually barred from the decision as having a closed mind. And she drew that on the basis not just that they had a strong opinion, but to agree that they had been a very strong community advocate. In other words, they'd written letters in the paper, they had signed petitions, and there was a whole track record there which suggests that their mind was probably closed. So again, a sliding scale, but you need a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that your mind was so made up it was closed. But I very seldom see that degree of evidence.
I think the answer is that you can hold strong views and you can express strong views, but you must maintain your mind open to the views of others and your colleagues. And a mistake that councillors often make is in the start of a debate saying, I'm going to vote against this. They shouldn't say that, because someone may have some information that may persuade them to take another path. So you make your decision on voting at the point of voting, and you keep your mind as open as possible up to that point.
Yeah, and I would absolutely support the way Alan phrased that.
It's very hard to do.
It is very hard to do, but I think sometimes, certainly some of our new councillors really put their foot in it without realising that they've made a difference for themselves. Now, I should point out that with the localism bill that the United Kingdom passed about 4 years ago, they actually made predetermination legal. They made the Prime Minister was really strong on this. He said people should be able to have these kind of views held strongly and be elected on that basis and just do it. So they actually passed the law to say predetermination in the UK is quite legal at the local level, but it's not in New Zealand. So we haven't picked that up yet. So I don't want to go here. This is just again a couple of slides which talk about what you are and what you aren't. You're not the dam maker, but you are the person who makes policy on dams. Let's leave it at that. I've moved on from the boys. It's a particular Victorian local government role. One of the things I thought was kind of useful, just finishing these off, in surveys, this is a UK survey looking at how councillors spend their time. And they found that in there that obviously they spend a lot of the time preparing for council meetings, preparing for committee meetings, and not that much liaising with council staff, dealing with the public. But when you look at where they felt they should be putting their time, 69% they should be doing much more listening to community views, local people, and dealing with complaints. That's very much a UK phrase, so I think we'll move on that. But just to show you that often when you're thinking about your role, where you're putting your time is often driven by other things, may not be where you personally think that you need to be putting it. Certainly that's reinforcing the involvement of engagement and knowing where your community is at when you come to the table. I'll leave these ones too. These just talks about the sorts of things we're looking at our elected members, and we'll probably be using that in our education and guidance that we're putting together. The sort of competencies, and there are a lot of them, and it shows you why I actually want to encourage people and councils to invest in their budgets for training elected members. That's just an advert, sorry. Just to remind everybody, the Chief Executive is your only direct employee. And the Act actually tells us quite clearly that their role is to implement the decisions of the Council, ensure that delegated functions and powers are properly performed. So that's that you employ the CE to do that. Ensure effective, efficient economic management, activities and planning, and determining the means to achieve the outcomes sought by the Council. So you're really trusting the Chief Executive to make those questions about how things are done. It doesn't mean the councillors, through the chief executive's employment contract, can't actually say, well, this is the kind of organisation that we want you to kind of deliver, but how you get there is very much in the hands of the chief executive. And again, this is the critical, so the difficult role chief executives are in is that they implement decisions. They also provide advice to the council, about decisions. So they kind of mix. We implement things and we advise. So we are not big enough, like central government, to distinguish, to separate out the advisory ministries, the policy ministries from the implementation department. So within councils, we have to sort of roll those two things together. Just a diagram which just kind of puts all that, we know all that stuff. And so just quickly finish, touch on the code of conduct, going back to your question. I've been promising people that this year we will actually review our code of conduct, because we haven't changed it since we wrote it in 2003. A lot of councils have amended it here and there, and we'd like to actually find out what's working very well for councils and what things just not helpful. And we're conscious that the legislation doesn't give us a lot of movement. But the critical thing about the purpose is to actually encourage good relationships, to focus on statutory obligations and roles, but particularly to kind of put out a mechanism for dealing with grievances. And that's actually in some cases creates problems for us, because we actually from time to time in councils, you actually can find councillors who really are very aware that any publicity is good publicity, and actually getting code of conduct complaints against you and getting yourself on the front page of the newspaper can actually be helpful for your re-election campaign, which worries me, but it does seem to work in some places. And so we want to look at that and how councillors, in a sense, can avoid that, if you like, vexatious councillor. And that kind of brings us back to, therefore, where do elected members fit into that? And this is what the code talks about in relation to the role of elected members, that their role is about developing policy, monitoring the performance against the stated objectives, which is an area where we think quite a bit more work can be done. Actually, what are the kind of things you actually want to measure? And we're often not very good at that. The stewardship comes up a lot, as I said, the employment and of course representing the interests. And there it captures those two roles. Your role as governing the organisations and representing the interests of your members. A lot of issues come up for us about relationships with staff. Some organisations, some of our members have very strict rules that elected members will only engage in staff through the chief executive and, say, the senior management. Other councillors are more relaxed about this. And I imagine if you were a councillor at Kaikoura District or Mackenzie, where I actually think there are more elected members than staff, I'm not joking. When I last counted, that's including community board members, I'm sure those roles are a little bit different. So the critical things there in terms of relationships, recognising the role of CE, being aware of the employment obligations. So one of the things that worries CE is that councillors, HR, they've got, you could actually find yourself dealing with employment grievances caused by, pressure put on individual staff members by councillors. That's part of the reason why chief executives will often insist that relationships are handled through a senior management. Whole issue of courtesy and respect. I think in one case I advised a chief executive, as a result of a code of conduct complaint, that he could actually prevent a councillor from putting a foot in a council office, except for council meetings, trespass them. So the council has there are a few tools that a chief executive can use. As I say, the impartiality of employees is pretty important. The critical one is avoiding public criticism of employees. Common question we get is, I'm really unhappy with the level of advice, I'm happy about the performance of that staff member, or you've got a community who's complaining about the attitude of particularly regulatory officers. This is probably more a TA issue. What do I do about it? And the advice is always go and put it through the chief executive and don't go straight to the staff member. All those things are fairly basic, and I'm sure you guys know that without me having to say that. So just to finish, so in terms of the governance tips we put out there, it's important at this level as being consistent. That is around, and to a degree it can be, because you are political bodies, and that's life. But this is about keeping the long view. We have got a big picture. We're steering that builds community confidence. It actually builds the confidence of your staff, because they now know what space they've got in which to work and feel consistent. internal conflict, these are fairly obvious. Every question it costs time and money. We sometimes have to remember that. Try not to, micromanagement, obviously not wise. Try not to meddle too much. I know, but there is a formal way of dealing with constituents' concerns. Use those formal processes. And finally, remember that your chief executive and your staff are actually ultimately your key assets. And so when you undermine those, one of the useful tips, try to avoid, but in Christchurch, before the earthquake, the council had gone through a massive reorganisation, I think. Something like 39 of the top 40 managers were all replaced in the space of 2 years. Now, unfortunately, the two managers who had gone to Kobe and researched how the city had recovered from the earthquake were both made redundant about 2 years before the Christchurch earthquake. So remember, you've invested in your staff; they're your major asset. Try to put, and their knowledge and their skills are really helpful too. And that again is a major lesson from Kaipara. My observation about Kaipara is that since I've been at Local Government New Zealand and earlier, they had the cheapest rates of any council in New Zealand. And they kept the cheapest rates right until about until recently. And the way they kept their rates down is they never employed staff. The council actually had adopted the policy where the chief executive was unable to employ qualified staff. And so in the end, the chief executive didn't just become the employer staff, he became the kind of chief contract negotiator, he became the chief expert in waste management plants, and he became the chief expert in public-private partnerships, and that was actually, a bit too much to ask of him. So, that whole question about the role of your organisation is actually really important that you invest in it. Sorry, that's the lecture. Sorry about that in the sermon, but any questions, further questions?
Well, I think the Mackenzie country's got the management should become the elected members. That sort of ties it all up, doesn't it?
Well, Fenton, I should point out that the current mayor, before she took her role as mayor, was the PA to the chief executive.
There's not many living in the basin. Okay, let's have some. And you're looking for some feedback from us too, correct?
Yes, please.
Okay, Councillor
I really do need to.
Just the point I want to come back to a little bit on is the challenge you issued to us to keep our council's eyes on the big picture, the overall the governance. But on the other side, councillors, in my view, are obligated to be informed. And very often it's the detail of the underlying issues which feed into whether or not the objectives are going to be met. So I would just have like your comments on that particular aspect, and famously on sewage systems. Norman Kirk won a great deal of popularity for proving the engineers wrong about the sewage system for the town he was in. The second thing I would like you to comment on is with regard to staff, there's a very good documents within the State Services Commission on staff and their position, the independence, that they do not represent themselves,
yes.
The anonymity of staff, that the collective. But I see transparent, all of those things, but I don't see the equivalent in local government, although it should be in my view. And following on from that, there's a very clear outline of what's expected of a chief executive in the state sector for central government. But if you look at the Code of Conduct and other associated documents, there's not similar, in my view, for chief executives of local councils. And I think those two things are significant weaknesses.
Thank you, Councillor. Certainly starting at the back, yes, the Local Government Act spells out at a very high level what the role of a chief executive is, but in the end it's actually then left to each council to kind of set those. We don't have any equivalent of the State Services Commission. I think that it's, well, I don't know how you could do it, but it also reveals a level of weakness which you've identified, which has to be filled either by LGNZ or the Society of Local Managers or councils individually, and if it's left to councils individually, you're going to get a diversity of practice around the country. We hope to kind of be able to improve a little bit on that through the work that we're doing with Equip and Scott in terms of developing kind of a standard set of performance benchmarks that councils can use around setting and managing the performance of their chief executives. So in the lack of any kind of equivalent to an SSC which can set broad standards, we have to figure out a way of developing something that are useful guidelines on the ground. So it is a bit of a gap, but I think, and one of the things, to be honest, it's certainly ever since I've been at LGNZ, we've always been rather poor at setting good performance standards for chief executives and monitoring them, and we need to kind of improve on that.
Could I suggest that you make recommendations on that for the code of conduct?
Yes,
Because
yes.
for members,
Yep.
it has a section, for the chief executive. There's a lot of effort being put on for members where micromanaged what we can. We're micromanaged what we can and can't say, but it's woefully inadequate. And I would have thought that's a very nice slot. And I'm sure LGNZ would come up with some good recommendations which council would be happy to adopt.
We could
into their
certainly look at
general
that, absolutely.
code of conduct. It
Yep.
would solve a lot of problems, in
Yes,
my view.
yeah, no, we could certainly look at that. Managing the detail and the big picture is one of those real challenges. I mean, you're going to have people on the ground telling you all sorts of detail. They're telling you that your engineers are wrong and et cetera, and but you've still got to figure out what is the process for feeding that information into management and ensuring that it's considered. One of the projects that is in our Excellence Awards, for the LGNZ conference coming up, that's been submitted by Horowhenua District, was an interesting one. A small community, not Shannon, but north of Shannon, much smaller of that, had an issue around drinking water. The council engineer had decided it would cost $3 million to kind of provide proper drinking water. The council figured they might be able to afford it in another 10 years' time if they were lucky. In the meantime, everyone would just have to continue to boil their water. That seemed to be the end of the story. That engineer moved on to another council. Another engineer stepped up, and he who had some experience in Africa, and he said, "I reckon we can do that for for about $500,000 or $600,000 and put the whole thing in a container." And so what was going to be a massive scheme well out of the cost of that community, based on the advice from that first engineer, proved to actually the council found an alternative that cost basically a tenth of the original sum. They did it within the space of 6 months, and the community's now got fresh water. So, that's the whole issue around asking the right questions as a councillor. And Horowhenua just thought that was the advice, that was it, there wasn't any other choice. Yes.
Councillor Belford.
A couple of your slides referred to one of them said test the veracity of advice.
Yes.
One of them said just testing advice. And it seems to me an important function of councillors is to, and one that inevitably creates a tension, is to do that testing. And to do it with some vigor, and in a way, the working at cross purposes to that is this, to me, very archaic notion that the only proper interface, in a sense, is the chief executive. The fact of the matter is we have senior employees making multi-million-dollar decisions for which they ought to be accountable and which the public observes them making. So it's not like they're anonymously operating within the confines of, let's say, this building as they go about their work. And so it seems to me that there's a literature out there on bureaucracies, and I'm not using that term pejoratively. No. There's a literature on bureaucracies and what the tendencies of bureaucracies are as they make decisions and as they process information and so forth. And most of that literature says if there is not fairly, I'll use the term aggressive, external questioning of what's going on, that you're going to get the worst results that a bureaucracy could provide, not the best. So it seems to me a lot of this is sort of loaded in and part of that assessing of testing advice does come down to the people giving it. And if the further you are distanced from the people who are actually the technical experts on the staff or what have you, the less opportunity you have to sort of take the measure, frankly, of, well, who's giving us this advice, and what's my confidence level in what they have to say? Where did they get there? How did they form their opinion? And by creating this sort of artificial, to me, separation between The bureaucracy that is supposed to be developing policy, developing advice for us and us, that it just creates an unnecessarily is not a healthy situation, but we're fended off, and a lot of the thrust of what you're saying is sort of strikes me as, hey, counselors, back off. When my sense is that's the last thing we should do, to be responsible to the folks whose money we're spending at the end of the day and whose lives we're affecting.
Well, if I could ask that, Tom, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, the first point is that in terms of decisions that are made by your officials, they are doing that under delegated power that you've given them. So again, the accountability sits with you. You just need to be aware of that and you can control. Second question is in terms of, yes, it is your role exactly to make sure that the advice that you're making your decisions on is the best advice and is appropriate to the kind of nature of the decision you're making. So that's the first point. So there will be some decisions that you're making that have very little risk. The amount you need to spend on advice is actually probably not a lot, and that's fair. And the other decisions, obviously, that are going to have significant risks if they go wrong, or financial risks. And you'd expect the level of advice to be that much more comprehensive and perhaps tested. The way you act, again, though, we don't expect people around the table to be qualified engineers who are able to kind of assess whether the pumps are the right level or whether it's got the right type of washers or the types of material. So the question is, how do you go about knowing that the advice that you're getting is appropriate for the decision that you're making? And you do that through, one, your choice of chief executive is important, and two, you do that through the nature of the firms that are actually, or the people and their qualifications that you're relying on to make that advice. So in terms of assessing the quality of that advice, you're frequently going to do it through where does it come from, what's their track record, how they recognise as experts in this field by their peers. It's things like, so that's that broad speak. It's like for us, for example, when councils approach us and they say, well, look, we have to employ our chief executive. Where do we go? And we say, well, there are probably 3 firms in New Zealand who've got really good experience of employing local government chief executives, and they probably aren't your local AHR firm that's got its office across the road, because that's where the experience of employing chief executives. So again, when you're looking for advice for the nature of the issue you've got, you're asking your chief executive to ensure that, one, they have tapped the people who are recognised within the industry or within the broader sector as having the skills and experience in that, because you're in a position where you can't be an expert in everything, so you actually have to rely on third parties, and therefore it's so that's again goes back to the question of your chief executive and your trust and confidence that your CE will be able to deliver you quality advice and drawing on appropriate sources for that advice. And often that won't be from within. Councils will have their own internal advisors, but they can't be experts in everything, and that's where, if you like, Kuiper fell over. They weren't experts in project management and all those issues. So the chief executive is going to go off on case-by-case basis to pull on experts from other fields, and your job is to basically feel the advisors that we got are qualified in their field. Are they appropriate for me to actually rely on them for making my decision? Yes.
I guess you're still casting that in terms of, I'll put it starkly, you're putting me at the mercy of the staff.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to be at the mercy of the staff as a councillor. I want to have access to full array of opinion, expertise, et cetera. And part of the imbalance that I see in the system is that councillors don't have any institutionalized support that they can draw upon if they wish to be skeptical of a direction that might be being pursued by the staff in any particular situation. And so, it's not, doesn't really answer that concern to say, oh, well, ask them for more.
Yes, that's right.
That's not an answer. So who do we ask?
I sympathise with you. I remember a very early conversation when I first started at LGNZ from a councillor at Wellington City who was most frustrated that he didn't have his own office and his own advisors, which he kind of felt he needed to be an effective councillor at Wellington City. I'm sure everyone around this table were like that. And we addressed that in Auckland, of course, by giving the mayor his own staff funded automatically, and his own advisors, so that he actually, so in Auckland it's a bit hard to know where advice is coming from, a variety of sources, but, but that unfortunately is something that most places can't afford to do. Within the system that we operate at the moment, we are largely dependent, we are totally dependent on the fact that our chief executive are the people who are going to be the ones who arrange that for us. Your issue is simply getting confidence from the CE that all the appropriate boxes are being ticked. Now, there are different ways and methods that you might be given that confidence, so there's no fixed way about that. But yes.
Just in regard to the CE, and this is no fault of Liz's, ever since us new councillors got elected, we've had an interim CEO, and the CE that this council actually employed, and you're stressing the importance of that relationship, doesn't even report to us. How long do you, as a situation, I've been really
that's a fair
concerned
question.
about this for a long
right.
time. How long is it tolerable for us to have that situation?
There's no right answer to this, and we've just had that question asked by the Mayor of the Far North, who's had an interim chief executive in place for the last 2 and a bit years. And I sent him off to the Office of the Auditor General to get some advice on that one, and he seemed still comfortable with his interim for a little bit longer at least. So again, from the Office of the Auditor General, who looks at these kind of issues, you have to argue it on a case-by-case basis, essentially. So the Far North, I think John's particular decision to keep an interim chief executive was based on what I think was a probably pretty sensible observation that looks like we're going to be amalgamated at some point. Probably not sensible to go through the whole process of having a chief executive on a 5-year contract. So let's keep Colin on for another year or two until we kind of know where the amalgamation's getting us to. So if there's a rationale, and that was sufficiently kind of prudent observation, we're not going to waste ratepayers' money. The OAG was happy with that. So in a sense, it's a case-by-case situation.
Just coming to Tom's position there, I mean, everyone has a different approach to things, but I just think that it is healthy to have a level of cynicism and a question, but you also need to balance it up when it's deserved by trust.
These are, yes.
And
True.
But if someone loses your trust, then that becomes a difficult situation.
Okay. Yep.
Can I ask a particular question in regard to, we talk about Kaipa and structural spending, structural stuff.
Yes.
What about consenting? How far into the machinery are we supposed to put our fingers into consenting? Are we? I know Horizons they had a consents board or something at one stage, and that was successfully challenged by applicants and thrown, predetermined and thrown out. And also around some of the planning stuff, you wouldn't expect councillors to write plans, would you?
No. Once you get, certainly around the quasi-judicial stuff, I think the rules change again. And certainly the whole predetermination and the interest issues change it again. I know around consenting, obviously the government's trying to push for sort of more independent commissioners. I'm not necessarily a huge supporter of that. I think elected members have got a critical role there, but this whole issue of having done the training and being trained accreditors, that's important. In terms of the plan, in terms of the role in planning, or in the development of a plan and plans, I think that councillors may be quite active in community organisations. Have still got a perfect right to kind of articulate views and perspectives in that plan, but in the end it's going to be a majority decision where the plan lands. I'm thinking of that on the way up, Fenton, to some degree, and it was trying to work out the distinction between public and private interests. And to degree which the council is associated with a private interest, I think things are really quite clear, and that is to stand back quite clearly. But if councillors are, say, involved in a local Save the Stream group or Save the Forest group, then the interests that they're promoting aren't necessarily private interests. No individual necessarily gains by that, but a public interest that you would expect them to perhaps articulate those views strongly in a planning environment, actually in the development of the plan. And I was trying to think of an analogy would be a wee bit like a minister in Parliament, having been sent off to develop a bill, and then goes into Parliament and argues that, well, we've got the bill and we want to pass it, these values and is a strong advocate for it in Parliament and in Cabinet, and around the Cabinet table votes for it as well. But in a sense, the minister's putting this forward because it's going to promote the public interest, may or may not win the debate. Yes, if that's helpful.
Right when he votes for it.
Yes, because there's no private interest in it. The difference between public and private, I think, is probably the only thing that you can make that distinction. Because in a sense, it goes back to Councillor Barker's view that if you're a politician and say you're elected on a particular view and the people have said this is a really important value, then you're expected to promote that view when you're in the planning process, obviously, because that's why you've been elected. Alan's point, you still have to have an open mind. That is that you're not fixed in that view, but you're not barred because there's no personal benefit coming from that view. And that's the personal benefit is the critical question.
What if you were a director of a company that's been for
Just microphone, Councillor Hewitt.
A director of a company of benefit would be seen to be a personal benefit, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Could I help you with that?
Yes.
I've come across this, and it's in the legislature. There is a distinction between public law and private law, and our Parliament used to pass quite a lot of private law. It very rarely does to this day. It's nearly always public law, which applies to people generally.
Yes.
Now, the Mayor of the Far North came into some trouble over this when he amended a document, a bill, to deal specifically with a boat ramp in his electorate to fix a problem he saw he had with it. And it was deemed to be private law because it had a very clearly defined group of people with whom it benefited. The boat ramp owner and someone else. And therefore that was private law, and the clerk struck it out because it was a public law bill. And I think the issue here about the difference between private and public is that where there is a very clear definition of a small group of people who are directly beneficial for it, it is private law. But if it's generally applicable, the renovation of a stream or whatever, anybody can go and look at it, it's public law. And therefore you're entitled to treat it in that way. That's my rough and ready definition of it.
That's where I'd probably go.
Councillor Belford.
I don't think anybody would argue that councillors should be involved in specific consents, but there are judgment calls being made all the time around the regulatory regime, and those have to do with, let's say, how vigorously are we going to be in enforcement mode, or how vigorously are we going to tend toward notification of consents versus none. And it seems to me in those areas, it is appropriate for councillors to have a view and to shape the culture in which those regulations are actually being approached, such that it might be appropriate for us to feel and to hope that our staff would feel likewise, that certain kinds of issues are sensitive in the community, and where you have the flexibility of judgment under the law to go this way, you go that way, you don't default, to this position, and that's really the nature of what goes on in the day-to-day business of government here. Nobody's saying no, don't approve that consent or whatever. Saying, well, we have a huge body of the public out there that feels they ought to have a say in this issue. Let's err, if you want to look at that way, let's err on the side of public engagement, and let's notify these things and make that the default position that we're going to notify, versus a default position being let's keep everything as close as we can.
So a question there, the legislation is quite clear on this stuff. It's pretty straightforward whether it meets the threshold to notify or not.
Yes, in terms of RMA notifications, yes.
How much influence should we have in that when the applicant has some rights here too, surely?
Yes. Now, I'm not an expert in RMA and that side of the business, but the question that interests me, and actually, to be honest, it's really interesting, the Rules Reduction Task Force at the moment. And some of you may have been at one of their seminars, because those of you who haven't followed the Rules Reduction Task Force say, well, how do we kind of deal with the issue of rules and the impact of rules? But where they've got to is, to be honest, they haven't found a hell of a lot of rules, apart from the building rules. building regulations, and probably what they found most of all is actually the attitude of regulators. The issue that most of the complaints, from what I could see, that they've had are to do with how rules are enforced. You know, if you like, it's how much discretion is applied at the local level, what's the attitude of people opposing regulations, and so I interpret Tom's view to some degree as what's the nature of the culture of it, and how's that interface at that level, and that your question, and second one on that, if you remember that the trigger that introduced the government to abolish Environment Canterbury was unfortunately the 10 local mayors going to the minister say the council's being too tough on us, which actually, it seemed to me that was probably the only regional council at the time which was actually fulfilling its duties, but never mind. But it did tell us something about how they were meant to be perceived. The question you've got there, Tom, is how you do that. Because you as councillors do set the tone of your you're able to set the tone of your organisation, but you do that actually through if you like, your employment, your contract with your chief executive. So you actually have to figure a way because the chief executive is essentially employing the staff and is setting the tone by which the staff work. So you actually have to kind of set that in your performance contract as to the nature of how you do that. Well, I think you can work on the assumption that your interim chief executive has to operate under the terms that you've actually created with your permanent contract, with your chief executive. That contract will govern what Liz does ultimately in the way she operates. That would be how we would interpret that. So the question is another anecdote. I'm sorry about this, but it's very current on my mind. I had just funny enough, in the last 2 weeks, I've had 2 ex-chief executives. One I met in Canberra last week at the Local Government Association conference there, comment to me on, only recently retired, and living in different districts from their own, say, my God, I'm having real trouble with the local council. Both of them put in plans for the first time in their lives to an annual planning session and came back and said, yeah, that was a terrible experience. The mayor was hopeless. No one took any notice of me. And both of them engaged with individual officers to get information or to do something and came back and said, God, they're treated rudely. And were quite shocked, really. And so it did come back to that. The interface that really matters is that sense of how, as a Mary public, how am I treated when I interface at that basic level of people on the floor? It makes a huge difference about how the relationship works, and that's, as councillors, you have some ability to influence that, but you do it through your chief executive and how you craft that employment contract.
You suggested we make the chief executive a rate player for a week.
Could make a big difference. Yes.
Hey, we've been going for an hour. Thank you, Mr. Reid. Any quick questions that haven't been covered? I'm not sure you've answered all our issues, but
I'll take a few things away if that's helpful.
Exposed a whole lot of stuff. Have you got any
too.
questions of us?
Yes.
Councillor Scott.
Because there was a slide quite some way back, and I won't go back to it, about building institution. Perhaps if we actually get a copy of the slides, it might.
I'm happy to give you those. Yes.
That'd be
Yep.
great,
Yep.
yeah.
And you've got them on your computer, so that's fine. You've got them on
Have
there.
you?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's fine.
thanks.
Okay, we'll get copies of that.
Yes.
Any other quick questions? Have you got any questions for us? You wanted to take away some stuff. Hopefully you've. Well, you'll
Not
move
far
it.
away now.
You'll move
Yes.
it, and someone will
Yep.
second it, and then
Yep.
we'll deal with that.
Yep.
So you've got.
Well, just thinking quickly, just at the code of conduct for the moment, in terms of any issues that people have had with that, what would you like to see changed from? And Liz, if you've got any thoughts from a staff point of view.
Well, the clause that says thou shalt be struck with a wet bus ticket 6 times across the cheek
Try and work
for,
on that. Yeah.
for getting there, it actually it defeats the purpose. It's for
Yes.
it's like the padlock on the road gate.
Yes.
It keeps the folk that understand what a padlock is out, but everyone else will smash it and go through. I mean, I'm not sure we're using it for what it was intended for.
Yes.
I think that's the
yeah,
issue.
that could be a good point there, actually,
Yeah.
Fenton. Yeah.
Could I add to Fenton's point there? I think what I sense in the code of conduct is a lack of appreciation of a fundamental of our constitutional rights, which is freedom of expression. And what we sometimes fail to accept is that we have the right to express ourselves freely. We don't have to agree with it. And I think there's sort of people are trying to slim down the robust debate and freedom of expression we're trying to make people agree. And I think that's, that's the tension there. That's from my part, anyway. I do think people should be free to express themselves. We're not free to agree with them. It should be able to be robust, but it should not be personalised,
And that certainly was part of what we're trying to do with.
we're trying to use it to, if people have been disrespectful, even though they don't feel they have been, but they actually have been, some, certainly to staff or colleagues.
Yeah, and that's
We come back to the code of conduct to try and deal with it, and actually that's, to me, that's not really what it was set up to do. So, and I'm not sure how we, as a community, or how the country actually deals with that. Because the code of conduct is not fit for purpose for that outcome.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yes, we need more tools.
It's surely an appropriate guide. It's a matter of whether people take any notice of it.
To
And
use it for
sentence,
sanction is the issue. There's challenges when you really get into push the button on it.
There's a lack of sanctions that you could apply. I
Well,
think,
there is, and
offensive.
it's open for challenge and all sorts of things. So.
That's right. So we
And
need a
that's
code.
why I think it's probably possibly the wrong construct to deal with that particular issue. But, your
Yes.
ability to express your views, etc.
Yep.
But
That's right.
so you're happy to move? We received the report. Thank you, Councillor Graham. We have a second, and Councillor Bevan. You wish to comment?
I do. Firstly, I want to thank you for a very fair and frank and open report. And this comes from somebody whose DNA comes from the borders of Scotland via the Mackenzie country where my father was born. And our natural inclination is to be contrary, and we take great offence when we're told what to do about it, how to do our job. So I thought you did, when you first sat down, that was my inclination, but you covered that very well and you managed me quite well, so well done to that. Secondly, I would just like to say that I take on board your point that, and it's clear to us all that we only employ the chief executive, and that happens to be Liz at the moment. But we as councillors, there seems to be a culture here that we can talk. Well, I certainly do talk quite openly to people such as Ian and Mike Adey and the people who run the operations, and I feel free and open to do that, and I do it often. And if I see I take issues to them, and they have managed to solve issues for me, I would take great exception if I couldn't do that. Just putting you on notice, Liz. I would take great exception. And so whether that's right or wrong, that's the way I'll continue to do it. And I did make a comment one meeting that I'm employed. I know I've got a responsibility here, but the people of Hastings elected me, and I represent the people of Hawke's Bay, and I will do that. So, just want to.
Just a very few words. Thank you for your presentation and the discussion. It's certainly been informative, and it helps to sort of think about what you're doing and how you should behave when you're sitting around this table. So that's been good. Just maybe a point of clarification to the issue that Councillor Barker raised before. I think Liz has always actually been pretty open in her invitation to us to talk to the next tier of management here. And I feel like him, and I think everyone else around this table does that. We feel free to approach some of the senior staff and engage with them directly, and that's a very good process from my perspective.
Thank you.
Speakers, Councillor Barker.
I'd just like to thank you, Mike, for a fabulous presentation. I think this is a much better way to deal with these issues than in a seminar. I think you've traversed things far quickly than we could have in a one-day seminar, and much better. And I would think it would be a good thing if this council invited you to one of the early council meetings in the next trimester. I think it would be a fabulous thing to do. Half an hour, it would set the scene. You're obviously very knowledgeable, very clear in your answers, and incredibly helpful.
Oh,
so
thank you.
I think it would be great to have you back shortly after the next election.
Thank you. Other speakers? Oh, Councillor Belford, sorry.
Just one other suggestion. You didn't comment at all about our relationship to council-controlled organizations, which is another area of
big area.
some
Yep.
murkiness. And
Yes.
I thought the Auditor General was supposed to be had on her work program a report on that subject, based
Still-
on.
Still waiting for it, Tom, but
Is it?
it's in there somewhere, yes.
But I think that,
Yep.
I wouldn't have minded seeing a slide in your presentation.
Thank you,
on-
I'll remember that, actually, a really good point.
That's a takeaway. Thank you.
Yep.
Summing up, all happy. I'll put the motion that we received that report. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. Thank you, Mike. Now,
Thank you for
need
the
a-
opportunity, I appreciate
No,
it.
no, and
Yep.
much appreciated. Do you need an office now to do some work, or are you going to
We've,
go,
we've changed your flight. You're leaving at 1:45.
or are you going to contribute to the Hawke's Bay tourism spend and go into town and buy a whole lot of stuff? Yeah. Good on you. Okay.